the Weekly Show with David J. Maloney. This week, David talks to trailblazing guitarist Steve Hackett of Genesis. And now, here's your host, David J. Maloney.
Welcome, everyone, to the Weekly Show. I'm your host, David J. Maloney. On tonight's show, we've got one of the truly great guitarists of the 70s. The band he might be best remembered for, Genesis, spawned the careers of not only himself, but Phil Collins, Peter Gabriel, and Mike Rutherford. His guitar style would be copied and built onto by thousands of players, and many still consider him to be one of the all-time greats of rock. So stick around because we've got former Genesis guitarist Steve Hackett coming right up. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Our featured guest tonight helped create one of the quintessential sounds of the progressive rock movement of the 70s. His time in the band Genesis led to world tours, countless hits, and would eventually spawn a solo career for himself and many of his bandmates that would find success all its own. Here to chat about his incredible music career is none other than world-famous guitarist Steve Hackett. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Lovely to talk. Thank you.
So it's obvious from the career paths of both you and your brother John that creativity runs in the family. I mean, what do you make of that? I mean, where do you think that came from?
Well, both sides of the family. My father played a lot of different instruments just for fun, and on my mother's side, there are musicians. The Jewish side of the family, there are musicians. So there's quite a lot in the genes, believe me, of all of that. So luckily, we both went professional with it, whereas others maybe were army buglers and drummers and various things. My dad was able to play a number of things, bugle and clarinet and harmonica, which he passed on to me. When I was a kid, I was trying to be just like him from the age of 2 onwards with harmonica. So music was always very important to me from a very, very, very young age.
When I was 13, I read To Kill a Mockingbird, and that inspired me to become an attorney. What inspired you to pursue music as a career? Was it your father?
As I say, yes, I think it was. There was always music in the household, and of course, I was born in the days before rock and roll. I was born in 1950, so that meant that radio was extremely varied. A lot of it was forces radio just after the war. What you would have is these sort of family favorites to different postings in what used to be the British Empire. And so radio would have a diet of Glenn Miller 1 minute, Elvis Presley the next. Actually, maybe I'm not sure that Elvis had arrived on the scene quite at that point, but you would get some Gluck, you would get some, in other words, you get classical music, some big band, pop music. It was all just light entertainment before it had become specialized, and so you could have anything on radio at that point in time. Don't forget, we only had 2 radio stations in Britain at this time. We only had the Home Service, which was for current affairs, news, all of that, and the light program, which covered absolutely everything else. So not a lot of choice in those days of standardization. But of course, it was all to change, and you always had a huge variety, I gather, in America, or so it seemed to us, which is why we Brits were always looking to America for inspiration, and I still do.
I read that one of the albums that had a huge impact on you was Bob Dylan's Highway 61 Revisited.
Yes.
What made that album so special in your mind?
Well, I think he was working with a great band at that time. And so I think that having been, a one-man show up to that point, had a band that had various talents in Mike Bloomfield on guitar, Al Cooper on keyboards. Yes, and I think the combination of those two when they were working with other people was a great mix. Of course, in the mid-1960s, I'd seen Mike Bloomfield working live with the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, and that was an incredible combination as far as I was concerned. But I was unaware at that time that that Mike was working with Bob Dylan, and I gather in latterly Bob Dylan said that Mike Bloomfield was his favorite guitarist. So I think that Mike had obviously infused that combo with a lot of energy, and that was what I got off stage when I was watching him live. With Butterfield was an incredible frontman, harmonica player, and his band sported two great guitarists, Bloomfield and Elvin Bishop. So they were great. The night that I saw them, they were all absolutely on fire.
And we had Al Cooper on the show probably about a year ago. And he, kind of like you, is kind of like a walking encyclopedia of music history. I mean, he's had his hands in, I mean, there's like 3 degrees of separation between him and like everything.
Yes.
And just an incredible keyboard player. So early days of your career, you put out an ad in the magazine Melody Maker advertising your services and seeking a band. Peter Gabriel of Genesis responds. When you think back on that moment, what sticks out in your mind?
Well, the truth is, I'd been advertising myself for 5 years, and so it was no overnight success. The wording of my ads became more and more specific and outrageous, and that's what I think attracted Pete. He could tell I was a committed, eccentric idealist like himself, and I think that's what really got me the gig. I didn't really know who Genesis were at the time. I hadn't heard of Peter Gabriel. You have to remember this was 1970, and they were up and running and they were doing gigs, but maybe not for long. So I was shortly to become enlightened, of course, and they were a great band to join. Great band then, great band now, and with a great frontman at the time, who was Peter Gabriel, who managed to personify so many of the songs in a convincing and entertaining way. He would take huge risks. At the same time, I was interested in that band expanding to the point where we had our own light show and a Mellotron and expanded keyboard arsenal. So I thought about other things. I didn't just have my ear and eye on the guitar. I was interested in how we presented ourselves. So I probably was hugely critical when I first joined them because I felt I had nothing to lose. 5 years of ads later, I imagined that my tenure with Genesis was going to last about 5 seconds, never mind the 6 or 7 years I spent with them.
So you're then in the band. You enter the studio with them for the first time with Nursery Crime. When all the instruments and vocals came together and you heard the final masters, how did that? What was your feeling at that moment?
I was very pleased with the album because I'd done an album 1 year earlier with another band, but we'd done no shows. And the lovely thing about that was I could tell that it was done to a high professional standard. I'm not talking about perfection because standards have changed since then. But I think we had something that it's funny because John Lennon gave an interview and said that we were one of the bands that he considered to be true sons of the Beatles. And when I subsequently listened back to some of those early efforts, particularly with Foxtrot, I can tell that there's a Beatle influence. It's subtle at times, but there'll be times when it's me doing something that perhaps George Harrison might have done on guitar. So George was a big influence. The Beatles were a huge influence. So when I look back on my time, I realized that we were the sum of our influences and trying to bite through the chains of or the shackles of whatever it was that was holding us back, with a fair amount of the anxiety of influence, of course, that goes in attendance with all of that. But that stays with you for life.
What was the origin of your iconic guitar tapping method? I mean, where did those ideas come from?
Well, I was trying to play one line from something I'd heard from Bach, and I realized that the quickest way to do it, the most efficient way, was to play it all on one string, where you were hammering on and off with both hands. I tapped on and off with the nail. subsequently, I sometimes do it with the pad of the finger. It all depends on which string you're after. If it's going to be the first string, I'll be using the pad of the nail. This is probably more information you need, but it has spawned.
My son will dig it because he's a guitarist. So he already kind of knew about it. So this may be a selfish question, honestly.
Well, it's become part of the either the glossary of terms, or it's expanded the references for guitarists. Basically, it's part of guitar language. It's part of guitar shredding language. That's how it is. You're using the whole of the fretboard rather like a keyboard. So it was a keyboard player that influenced me in the first place, in the shape of the glorious Johann Sebastian Bach.
And if I'm not mistaken, Eddie Van Halen at some point claimed he kind of got his idea for his own guitar tapping from attending a Genesis show. I don't know if there was a story there or not.
Apparently, yes. And I think one of his famous pieces he says he got from Shadow of the Hierophant, where I've got a tapping section where the guitar is on its own and it taps away. So I think the piece Eruption is he said it is based on that, and it's a great shame that I never got to meet him, so we didn't get to connect, but I know he's in spirit, and I think he was a stunning player, there's no doubt about that, and so to play a small part or be part of the building blocks that enabled his incredible technique to flourish is a proud moment for me.
You mentioned the Mellotron earlier,
yes.
and I know that you were probably, I guess, the driving force between, in having that become something that the band used. One of the main reasons the band added the instrument. Where did you first run across the Mellotron?
First time I'd seen a Mellotron used live was with King Crimson in 1969, before they recorded The Extraordinary in the Court of the Crimson King. So I'd also seen Moody Blues with one, and it seemed to me that the bands that possessed the ability, if you closed your eyes, to imagine that you were watching much more than the sum of the parts. You were hearing a symphony orchestra plus a band, and depending on how it was recorded, of course, some bands managed to make it sound just like a Mellotron and a squeaky thing. Other bands could make it sound absolutely symphonic, and if you think of tracks such as Epitaph, with King Crimson, you hear something that is mighty. I think that I've always been drawn to the idea of symphonic rock, or rather expanded rock, inclusive music. And once the Beatles started working with string sections and brass and many more things beside, Indian musicians, instruments that you hadn't heard of, it seems to me that world music is at its best fully inclusive, and is allowed to, in my book, is allowed to involve influences from absolutely everywhere and every time. Jazz influences, classical influences, pop, rock, blues, you name it.
It makes me think of Paul Simon's Graceland album, which had so many African influences in it.
Yes,
and that was something that it was it seemed like seemingly a big departure for him, but was such a phenomenal record in and of itself. What Genesis album are you the most proud of as you look back, or is it tough to choose because it's like choosing between children?
Well, it's a funny thing. I would have said a year or so ago, Selling England by the Pound, but it's the 50th anniversary this year of Foxtrot, and I'm just about to go into rehearsals with my band to go out and start playing it in its entirety. And listening back to it, some tracks which I haven't heard for a very long time, I'm struck by the quality of it, the quality of the writing and the breadth of ideas. And I think that it's extraordinarily well written. As always with early albums, there are things that I would change because personal experiences in production and techniques for recording things have shifted so greatly. You know, the goalposts have shifted so much since that time, and personal knowledge and the way things are approached in today, the way drums are treated with compression and deliberate distortion and ambient miking and all of that, and to be able to create the sound of, for instance, the way the Mellotron sounded when we were in Palace Sports in sports halls in Italy, and made the Mellotron sound absolutely huge and wonderful. And yet when I listen back to the album, I hear it sounding fairly small and dry, and I want to change it. So over the years, I've revisited quite a lot of this material and re-recorded some of it, and in some cases added literally a symphony orchestra as well. So I tend to pull out all the stops when I do re-records of older material, and I want to honor the spirit of the original, but I also want to broaden its shoulders and expand the canvas, really, you know. So I love the way it was written. I think the execution can always be a little better. And I had this conversation with Bill Bruford some years ago, where he said to me, "Oh, I understand why you want to record this stuff. You want to have it in tune and in time simultaneously." And this is it. It isn't enough just to have, you know, whatever it is that pleased fans at the time. You want to leave it with your own mark on it. Even if it's just a footnote to the original, to be able to say, yeah, well, that bit, yeah, boom, better guitar sound, sustain, all those things I wanted to have back in the day. And yeah, I mean, I'll go at these re-records very often and use up to 300 tracks. And of course, back in the day, we would have only had, with the very first album I did with Genesis, 16 track, and then 24, etc., etc.
Walk me through the creation of Firth or Fifth. How did that song come about?
Firth or Fifth was an idea that Tony Banks. He basically had the whole song worked out, other than the instrumental parts when the singing stopped, and I started playing the melody that was originally played on piano and would first be introduced on flute. I started playing it on guitar and using bends to make it sound a little bit more Eastern, and I thought it was a great melody. And again, as soon as he added Mellotron to it, plus the band, plus organ, plus we had bass pedals, so you had all this sort of, you had the kind of foundations of classical stuff. Yes, if it had been orchestra, it would have been basses instead of bass pedals, but you had that. I think Mike Rutherford added some sped up guitar to it to do the arpeggios, and I think it was a very beautiful sounding track. And I think Phil's drumming is really very, very good on it. I think it was a standout track, and it's the most famous Genesis guitar solo. It is the one. That's it.
Is it true that Dancing with the Moonlit Night was originally going to be called Disney? And if so, what's the story there?
Well, actually, the story is that it was probably going to be called Selling England by the Pound, but that ended up being the title of the album. Yeah. And we didn't want to bring too much focus to bear on one track to the exclusion of all others. The Disney idea comes from the very last section, the very quiet jam over two repeated chords that Mike Rutherford plays. And for some reason, we used to call it Disney. I think we had in mind that it was a little bit like a cartoon, and it wouldn't be the first time that we were influenced by the music that Walt Disney used. And I think, again, it's this Beatle connection that is so prevalent. You hear the influence of Disney upon the Beatles. I'm the Walrus is a kind of audio cartoon. And of course became a cartoon later on when there was Yellow Submarine, the movie. But I think we Brits were influenced by not just all things American, but all things caricature, cartoon.
That's our show for tonight. Thank you so much for watching, and a special thanks to Steve Hackett for joining us. Stay safe, everyone.